Hello everyone, welcome back to the H.V.M.N. podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Latt Mansor, a PhD in Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics, and the research lead of H.V.M.N. and Nutrition. And if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and leave a review, and if you have any question, leave us a comment, and as always, we appreciate it if you can share it with a friend. Now, without further ado, let's get into this episode of H.V.M.N. podcast. All 8 billion of us are doing metabolism at all times. This show is about learning what metabolism is, how it affects you in every way possible, from mood and mental state to performance and energy. We are all about fine-tuning the human experience for you to achieve the best self you can be. And if you are someone who loves science, curious to know how your body works and how to optimize it, then you are in the right place. This is the H.V.M.N. podcast. Thank you, Mary, for coming on to H.V.M.N. and Nutrition podcast. Now, before I do an introduction to Dr. Mary Pardee, as usual, we'll take a shot of Ketone-IQ. You look so nervous. All right, cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for having me. Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Not as bad as you thought.
Oh my God, not as bad. I'm still alive.
So, Dr. Mary Pardee, she is a naturopathic medical doctor and certified functional medicine doctor, specializing in gastroenterology and hormone balancing, based here in Los Angeles. Thank you very much for taking time to be on our show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So, your title has a lot of fancy words and a lot of different terms here. Let's break it down a little bit. Tell our audience, tell our listeners, what exactly is naturopathic doctor? What is functional medicine? Mm-hmm. And most importantly, let's go into the gastroenterology and hormonal balancing bit after.
Yeah, absolutely. So a naturopathic doctor is somebody who's trained in both integrative holistic medicine as well as conventional medicine. And so we go to a 4-year medical program after your undergraduate. And we really start to learn a lot about a variety of different things. But one of the things that we focus on is herbal medicine. We go deep into nutrition. We also talk about the mind-body connection. And so we have a lot more psychology courses involved. And so it is a really holistic program that kind of encompasses a wide variety of different tools to have in our tool belt. We also learn pharmacology, so prescribing medications as well. But we try to focus on the things that we can do first if we don't need to go to the medication. And that's not always the case, so I do prescribe. But if I can do everything with changing someone's diet, exercise, lifestyle, and don't need anything else, then great, that's all I'll do. And then my next modalities are using herbs, vitamins, minerals, and if a medication is the best option, then of course I'll use that. But just a few more tools in the toolbox. That's right. What I like to say.
Right. So basically, I'm really glad that you mentioned the psychology, the mental health part of things, and combining that, because I think conventional medicine or conventional healthcare, we're looking at someone goes to a doctor, they refer to a specialist, and if they feel like there is a need for psychotherapy, they'll then refer them to that specialist as well. Mm-hmm. So instead of having all these different departments, you're having all in one. Is that the right sort of interpretation?
It is, and I would also say I'm not a mental health specialist. So there's people that just have gone to school for only mental health, psychotherapy, psychiatry, mm-hmm. And so instead I have a wide range of tools to choose from, and I can only go so far with people in each category. And so a lot of the times I'm also referring out to a therapist or psychiatrist if more is needed.
Right.
But I'm really fortunate, and I feel like this is one of the best things I have in my toolbox is to start on that journey, and more importantly, just know when something is there to pick up on. And so I think one of the issues with conventional medicine is there's not enough knowledge about mental health to even identify when it is the root cause of the issue. And so that's when you see people who have gone through all of these treatments, they've been referred to all the specialists, and really a lot of their issue is rooted in trauma. Mm-hmm. And so I consider myself a trauma-informed practitioner, and I think that's one of my greatest tools is just the ability to pick up when there is something related to mental health that's involved in the physiology of their physical ailment.
Right. It's a lot to do with perspective of why these symptoms are manifesting itself, and the patients can only present itself with all these symptoms. They can't. They're looking at you for the interpretation, and therefore having a different perspective, having a more holistic perspective might help seeing things a little bit differently. So let's talk about gastroenterology.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's the study of the gut. So I am not a board-certified gastroenterologist. Instead, I'm a naturopathic doctor who decided to really deep dive and specialize in gastroenterology. And so 80% of my patients come in with some sort of gut issue, whether it's IBS, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, reflux, any of these types of things where basically they just have gut issues. So the most common complaint I see is bloating or constipation, diarrhea, alternating, or GI discomfort in general.
Right. And it says here hormone balancing. Like whenever I hear hormone balancing, most of the time they refer to female patient. Is that true, or does that also apply to male patients?
Both, yeah, absolutely both. And at this point in my career, I need to update my bio because I'm not doing as much of that as I am the gut, just because it turns out that a lot of people have gut issues. So I'm really deep diving in that. But in naturopathic and functional medicine, when somebody comes in, we're looking at the whole person. And so when I'm doing a blood panel, I'm not just looking at the gut usually. I'm also looking at hormones. When somebody comes in with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, especially if they're male, I really want to look at their testosterone, but also females too, because it's really common to see low testosterone in those with IBD.
And they're all connected.
They're all connected.
Yeah. So I am so glad we have a gut expert here today. But before we go into the science of IBS, IBD, I want to ask, the difference and stuff. Let's tell our audience who Mary Pardee is. How did you end up here? Like what sparked the interest and passion around gut health, around medicine?
Yeah, so I came here because of my own health journey, and I think that's really common with people that have gone into something a little bit more alternative. Is I did not become a doctor to make a bunch of money. If I did that, I would have done a totally different specialty for sure. But I came here because I had gut issues growing up, and I was diagnosed with IBS at a really young age, and went through the colonoscopy, endoscopy. I had capsule studies. I had so many, I was poked and prodded in so many ways that a young girl does not want to be, and really hit the end of conventional medicine. I remember I was at this doctor's office in San Diego, and he looked at my chart, and which was really big at that time because I had seen so many specialists, and he looked at me and he's like, listen, there's nothing else we can do for you in conventional medicine. You've tried every medication. We've tried every therapy with you. This is it. You're not going to die from IBS, but you're going to have to deal with it. And I walked out of that office in tears and being
How old were you then?
At that point, I was in my 20s, early 20s.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I walked out in tears and really reflecting back on that, I was so disappointed, not with just the news that he had given me, but also how he delivered it. And so at that point, I was really resistant to his news of nothing is going to work. And so I said, okay, well, if you don't know, then I'm going to figure it out. And so that's really when I started the journey myself of saying, I'm not going to rely on others at this point to figure my issue out. I'm going to do it myself. And that's when I decided to go back to school, become a naturopathic doctor, and just see what else was out there. And that's how I got here today, is just really becoming the doctor that I never found as a young girl. And I'm really grateful for what I do. And I get to help people now with the same issues that I had.
That's an inspiring story. Let's look into IBS, since you mentioned it. What is IBS actually, and what's the difference between IBS and IBD? What causes it?
Sure. So IBS is irritable bowel syndrome, and so yesterday I diagnosed a girl with it. And when you diagnose somebody with IBS, you say you have irritable bowel syndrome. And they look at you and they're like, yeah, no shit, I have I told you my bowel was irritable, right? I know that. It tells me absolutely nothing. And that's a diagnosis in conventional medicine. It's just a labeling of symptoms, and that's what IBS is. It's a conglomeration of symptoms that somebody has. And so with IBS, usually somebody has abdominal discomfort is a hallmark symptom. So feeling like your abdomen is tender, especially when we palpate it on examination. Bloating is a very common symptom of IBS. Distension, or just the feeling of bloating. So that means your stomach is actually sticking out, or it just feels like there's pressure in there. And then the other hallmark is changes in stool frequency or consistency. And so that means that you're either going to the bathroom very frequently or very infrequently. So you're constipated, or you have more diarrhea, or your stools are really hard, or they're really soft. And so we have this tool in gastroenterology called the Bristol stool chart, which if my patients are listening, they will know because they've seen it multiple times. But basically, when someone comes in my office, I'm showing them pictures of poop and saying, what does your poop look like? And so it starts off Bristol stool chart number 1, which are like those small little rabbit pellets, really, really hard poops that are like not even contained in one log. And then it goes down to a 7, which is water. So that's like very watery diarrhea. Do you think you're going to have this conversation?
Never would I have thought, I've studied metabolism and PhD and become the research lead of H.V.M.N, and we talk about poop 10 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah.
Hey, well, you know what? We learn new things every day.
We do.
And so anyway, tell me more about this, this scale. So you ask them, how it looks like, sort of consistency and all that. So that's syndrome, right?
That's irritable bowel syndrome. Yeah, exactly. And so there's 3 different types. So you have IBS-C, which is constipation predominant IBS, and that's somebody that is basically a 1 or a 2 on the Bristol stool chart. They're having harder stools and less frequent stools, and that has to be for months going on. So it's not
I was going to ask you, what's the
happens.
period of time before they're, obviously we go in and out of constipation or like diarrhea or whatever.
Right.
How long does it have to be consistent in order to be categorized as that?
Yeah, you need to have at least 6 months that you've had these symptoms for. And so if it's just been a week, then, especially a week of diarrhea, you're looking at, could it be infectious, or could it just be that you went through something really stressful and then you'll never have it again in your life? So this has been ongoing for months for somebody, and it's not going away.
Okay.
And then so you have IBS-C, then you have IBS-M, which is a mixture, and that is that somebody alternates from constipation, and then they have diarrhea sometimes, and they go back and forth, and then you have IBS-D, which is diarrhea predominant, so that's somebody going to the bathroom multiple times per day, and looser stools on the Bristol stool chart.
Okay. And then what's the difference between IBS and IBD?
So they're very different. They get confused because they sound similar, but they're actually pretty different. So IBD is inflammatory bowel disease. And so if you do a colonoscopy on somebody with IBS, which you usually will at some point, because you have to differentiate between the two of them. And so if somebody comes in with diarrhea and you don't know the cause of it, and it's been ongoing and it hasn't responded to the first-line treatments, then a lot of the times you're going to do a colonoscopy on them, even somebody with constipation, actually. And that's when you scope the colon. So you go through the rectum with a camera, and you can see the whole colon and part of the small intestines as well. And in somebody with IBD, if they have ulcerative colitis, a form of IBD, you'll see inflammation of that colon. So somebody with IBD will come in and they usually have diarrhea. Sometimes they can have constipation, but usually diarrhea. But they'll have blood in the stool a lot of the times, and you should not have that with IBS. And so the difference is this inflammatory response that's happening in the body with IBD that you should not see with IBS. And so we're talking about like myths and things that just people throw out there, but a lot of people with IBS will come and say, oh, I'm so inflamed, it must be the inflammation. And that's not really the cause for IBS, but it is the cause for IBD, where there's a higher level of inflammatory cytokines that are causing this inflammation, and then you'll actually get bleeding of the GI tract.
That's a really good point that you just said. Inflammation. It's a term that has been thrown around so much, and people often associate just not feeling good with inflammation.
Yes.
Which may not necessarily be actual cause of why you're not feeling good.
Yeah.
Now, let's dig deeper into the science. What causes the disease, both IBS and IBD? What actually cause these diseases?
Great question. The answer is we don't fully know, which makes them both really difficult to treat. So you look at peptic ulcer disease, which is an ulcer of the stomach, right? And we know now, we actually didn't used to know. We used to treat it with a vagotomy. We cut the vagus nerve and said, like, what will that do for an ulcer? Nothing happened. And then we finally realized nothing was happening because it was due to, most of the time, it was due to an infection of H. pylori.
Okay.
So now we know the cause of peptic ulcer.
And for the listeners, H. pylori is...
It's a bacteria, and when you have a certain amount of it, causes an infection in the gastric lining that can cause an ulcer, which is basically like an erosion of the gastric lining, a lot of pain, sometimes bleeding as well that happens there. And so now we know the cause of that. Right now, we don't fully know the cause of IBS or IBD. We know that inflammation is the cause, but what's causing the inflammation? And so we believe that for IBD, Crohn's and colitis, the two main forms of IBD, it could be a mixture of changes in the gut microbiome, as well as some cause of inflammation and dysregulation of the immune system, where the immune system almost starts to attack itself like an autoimmune condition, but a little bit different. But there is this heightened sense of inflammation that's going on, but we don't fully understand the actual cause. And so right now, the main treatments for IBD are biologics or anti-inflammatories, things like mesalamine. And so we just have the things to suppress the inflammation, but we don't know like why that's there and how to totally shut it off at the root cause. And so we're still working on that, and hopefully we'll eventually get the real answer. But in my practice, what we do with IBD is we try to go as close to the root cause as possible and really look at that microbiome. And so one of the treatments that we offer our patients in our clinic is something called fecal microbiota transplantation. And so it's a FMT, but quite literally, you're taking the stool of somebody who is well and implanting it in somebody that has ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And that is restoring the microbiome. And if that is really the root cause, then they should get better. And a lot of the times people will go into remission after FMT if they have IBD. Sometimes they won't. So then it's like, what else is the cause?
Wow. So I'm not very familiar with the fecal I've heard of it, the fecal transplant. Do they have the complications of organ transplants, for example, like sort of rejections and all of that? Does that happen?
No, you don't have that happen because your stool is not necessarily your human cells, right? So your immune system is always in contact with the lumen of your gut, which is that tube that goes through your whole body and is the outside of your body. But the contents of your intestines, like the stool, is actually not you, right? It's bacteria. Mm-hmm. So the majority of your stool and dried weight is bacteria, and then there's food particles. Right. But it is on the outside of your body. And so that's something that we usually don't think about, where the gastric lining and the intestinal lining is just like your skin in that it's a barrier from the inside of the outside of the body. So it's not like we're putting an organ inside of your body. We're actually restoring something that's on the outside of your body. And for this reason, and amongst other reasons, is usually people with IBD, if they get better from FMT, it'll last for a period of time, but they usually have to re-up. And so there's something going on internally that they're not able to keep that same microbiome from being established. And that could be
diet, that could be lifestyle, all of that.
All of that, or something that's going on with their immune system. And then we do know that one of the other things is the overuse of antibiotics may be associated with the development of IBD as well. But it's not for everybody. And
then now they even started to show that overuse of antibiotics actually lead to Parkinson's due to the microbiome damage. So that's super interesting, and we can talk about that. But when you use the fecal matter from a quote-unquote healthy person, how do you determine that healthy person? Is it just because that person doesn't have any symptoms, or do you actually measure the different bacteria that is in the fecal matter of this person?
Yeah, good question. I also want to put a disclaimer out there that I'm realizing I haven't said yet, is that the U.S. has not approved FMT for people with IBD yet. And so it's only approved FMT for people with a Clostridium difficile infection that creates a pseudomembranous colitis in the intestines and is life-threatening, especially in the elderly population. And so you can go to a donor stool bank, get donor stool through your doctor, and get FMT for C. diff. With IBD, it's much different, and that's why we've decided to be a part of it, is it's much harder to get FMT with somebody that has ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And so what we do in our practice is we're acting as a safety kind of prevention, just like if you're going to tell kids don't have sex, okay, great. They're still going to do it because they want to. People with IBD are sometimes desperate to get help. Yeah. And so people are doing this underground all the time. And so we think that it's our responsibility to help screen their donors for them to mitigate the risk of potentially contracting an infection from their donor. And so that's what we do in our practice, is that if somebody comes in with IBD, we tell them, okay, have you thought, they say they have ulcerative colitis. We say, have you heard of FMT? We're educating them on it. And we're saying, this is what the ideal donor looks like. And so once they think of who is that person in their life, and I'll go through kind of the key points of that, then we would screen that person for them and ask them a bunch of medical questions about their past medical history, their family history, their medication use, their travel, and then we would also do stool tests and blood tests on that person. So when you're looking for an ideal candidate for FMT, you want somebody that's healthy all around. It's not just their stool patterns. And so we want to see, are they mentally healthy? Do they have any past history or current history or family history even of schizophrenia, bipolar, major depressive disorder, anxiety? Everybody is going to have some form of anxiety and depression at a level, right? In terms of, I get anxious sometimes. That's normal. So we want to differentiate from clinically diagnosed anxiety and depression versus normal periods of I'm a little down or I'm a little anxious. And so you want somebody that's as mentally healthy as possible, because we know that there is likely a connection to the gut microbiome with that. The other thing is physically healthy. So you want somebody metabolically healthy. You don't want to use somebody that is overweight, obese, has diabetes, any of the metabolic disorders as well. And then the other things that are a little bit more obvious is you don't want somebody that has something that's transmissible in the stool. So if they have an infection of Clostridium difficile or something gut-borne that could be passed to somebody else, that's what we're screening for in the stool as well. And then we're doing tests on them in terms of looking for hepatitis in the blood, things like that. So we're trying to mitigate risk of transmission of anything. But in general, just somebody that looks really healthy, that feels healthy, and has normal stools. So you want them to be going to the bathroom every day, formed stools, not loose stools, not bloated or having gas all of the time. And
so the perfectly healthy human. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge our sponsors of this show, Ketone-IQ, the best exogenous ketone you can take to elevate your blood ketone levels. I personally take it every day before a podcast to wire my brain up, before and after my workout to really fuel my body. So give yourself a chance, take a shot, and you will feel the difference within minutes. So head over to hvmn.com and use the code H.V.M.N.POD20, that is H.V.M.N.POD20 for 20% off your purchase, and enjoy your Ketone-IQ and give your brain the perfect fuel.
Doesn't exist.
Do they exist? I was going to ask, I was like, where do you find them?
Does not exist, absolutely. And you see some people struggle and they're like, but they have this, they have this. We're like, okay, those are normal. That's human. That's just human, right? And so we try to like differentiate human from, no, this is an issue that we probably wouldn't recommend that for you.
Right. Yeah. And for the sake of our listeners as well, could you tell us what is ulcerative colitis?
Mm-hmm. So ulcerative colitis is a form of IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, that affects just the colon. So you're looking at the colon, which is the large intestine. It's the last portion of the intestinal tract before the rectum. And that is that one that there's a lot of inflammation in the colon. Usually someone will experience diarrhea and blood in the stool, most common things.
Is it pain as well?
Yeah, abdominal pain with passing stool. Bloating is another common symptom of it, but any of those things can be present. Yeah.
As you were describing how you were finding or trying to find the perfect healthy human, a thought sort of came to my mind, when people are like, oh, they have anxiety for like every now and again, like being normal human, but not necessarily being diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And in the age of hypochondria and availability and over accessibility of information and data on the internet, some people might say, oh, I'm anxious all the time. And then they start searching and then they feel like, oh, I probably have anxiety, but they don't. But then do you think over time that actually reinforces it and make them develop, like, is it possible for them to develop like that sort of disorder? As a doctor yourself, just to play that sort of hypothetical question.
Totally. I'm trying to think. There's a couple ways to answer this. And for me, somebody who is searching online about their anxiety, if they're anxious, I think they have anxiety. So Dr. Google, sometimes I'll actually ask patients in the office, how much of your time do you spend researching the symptoms that you have? And that's a telltale sign for me as to how obsessive somebody's mind is and anxious and hypervigilant somebody's mind is. And so I talk a lot about the nervous system in relation to gut-brain connection and mental health. I'm actually doing a course in mental health called Somatic Experiencing that's all about hypervigilance of the nervous system. And it's really, really important because when somebody is hypervigilant, and what I mean by that is they're scanning their environment and their inner environment and themselves, they're going to find something wrong with them. If you and I right now just like scanned our entire body, we could likely find something, right? Like whether it's like a little twinge or pain or tingling or whatever it is. And so my main goal is to get people off of Dr. Google because it's our biggest issue in functional medicine, especially because in functional medicine, one of the great things is we're empowering people to really feel the best version of themselves and be as healthy as possible. But then there's a really dark side to that in that you can go too far. If you're looking for any little thing that's wrong with you, something will be there or develop if it's not already there.
So people being perfectionists as well.
Yeah, I'm speaking to the person that I tried to treat, and that was something that I found is that, my own mind is highly obsessive if given its own resources and left, to its own things that I can do by myself, and type A and perfectionist, and it does not suit well for physical health usually.
And it just dawned me as well, if somebody is searching so much about their discomfort or their something that they think is wrong about them, it also sort of correlates probably with the frequency of that sort of episodes that come with it that is bothering their lives and actually causing or creating obstacles in them leading a normal life, or in their mind, a normal life.
Absolutely, 100%. And so it's, I talk about this every single day with patients, is that I ask them the question of how much time do you spend thinking about your symptoms? Just this week, a girl said 90% of the time I'm thinking about my symptoms. And so this is real too, and that's not uncommon. That doesn't surprise me. It might surprise you.
Yeah, 90%?
90% of their day, yeah. And that means that it's not 90% straight. It's like, okay, I'm doing a little work, and then bing, something comes up in my head like, does my stomach hurt? Or I eat something and then I say, will my stomach hurt after eating this? Or I go to the bathroom and I look in the mirror and my stomach is sticking out more than I would like it to be. I'm like, oh, I'm distended. That was something that I ate at lunch. And so it's these constant things that are just popping into your head where you're still able to function and go to work and do your job, but it's almost like there's somebody else in there just berating you with, is this going to be an issue if I eat it? Or how do I feel right now? And it's a real distraction to your daily life. And what also I see is there's usually alongside of it is this lack of feeling like you're living in purpose there. Because if you're really living in purpose, then hopefully it's pushing out a lot of those thoughts because you're filling your life up with all of this goodness. That, not to be said, that voice in the head can get really strong and really loud, and sometimes you actually have to retrain it to get that out of there. It's not just doing the things that make you feel good.
And do you think that's a mental health issue, or is that actual, other issue that sort of led to you just being more worried, more anxious?
Whew,
because when you talk about voices, right, like that reminds me of in mental health health patients, they have those voices that
Yeah.
tell them,
Right.
whatever.
Right. There's like schizophrenia where you're literally hearing voices at times, right? But the voice I'm more talking about is your inner voice.
Okay.
Just your voice saying,
Got it.
do I feel bloated? So those are different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is a mental health issue, though. And so what caused that, though, is I really believe most mental health issues are rooted in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that this is a response that the body has to keep us safe. And so it is not an issue necessarily. It's an adaptation that our body is making to ensure that we're safe. And that's what hypervigilance is.
Defense mechanism.
It's a defense mechanism. Yeah, it's protecting you. Because something bad happened, and now your brain wants to scan your environment to make sure that something else that's bad does not happen. And just because it's a defense mechanism or an adaptation doesn't mean that it's serving us, and doesn't mean that we not need to do something about it. And so it's definitely beneficial when people can start to rewire their brain to get out of those obsessive thought patterns.
This is a super interesting point, a super interesting conversation, because just recently I interviewed Dr. Chris Palmer from Harvard. He's talking about redefining mental health as a brain metabolic disorder, but he also admits and acknowledges that there are certain mental illness that is caused by trauma and that it should be treated accordingly. That is different from brain metabolic disorder. So there you go.
Yeah, and I would even I really respect him. And so but I want to question too, is if you keep asking the question why, do you eventually get to a trauma? So let's take, for instance, the person that is obese, has insulin resistance, maybe even is fully diabetic, and they do have metabolic issues going on that are perpetuating depression, that are making them eat more. You know what I mean? Like, that's a cycle that's going on. But then if you ask the question of, how did they get here in the first place? Why are they obese in the first place? Well, it's because they were binge eating. Well, why were they binge eating? That's an addiction, right?
Right.
And why do addictions form? And addictions usually form because there's a void. There's something that's lacking in somebody's life, a need that's not being met. Why is the need not being met?
Right.
Well, because in childhood, their need of attachment wasn't being met.
Okay.
And that's a trauma. That's a definite trauma, is a need of attachment in childhood, or a need of something in childhood not being met. And so I just wonder if we look at even metabolic issues, if we ask why, do we eventually get to a trauma? And I totally understand that not 100% of things are caused by trauma. I'm not saying that by any means. I'm just saying a large majority of things that are, rooted in, obesity, overeating, there is a trauma component to them. There was a really interesting study that's coming to mind now, and it's a pretty old one. I don't know all the specifics, but this doctor put people into a weight loss program, and so he was successful at getting these obese people to be able to lose weight. And then what happened is he followed them, and most of them gained it back. And he's like, "What the heck? Like, this was successful." They lost the weight, and then they gained it back. And then he did another study, and what he looked at is he looked to see how many of those people had adverse childhood events or traumas in childhood, and there was a really good percentage of those people that did have them. And so he did a second study where he treated those people for trauma and did all the weight loss strategies. Then they were able to lose the weight and keep it off.
Wow.
And this was like really pivotal in the weight loss industry, as well as in the mental health field, where, holy cow, we should be asking people that are unable to lose weight or are obese their history of trauma. And the idea behind it is that weight can be a mechanism to cope and to protect us from something else bad happening. So if you were sexually assaulted, that was one of the biggest correlations they found, was sexual assault.
I've seen that one, yeah.
And if you're sexually assaulted, then putting weight on can protect you from a future sexual assault, right? And so, yeah, we can get the person to lose weight, but they might not be able to keep it off if they feel like they're still in danger. And so that's, just something to consider there too. But of course, there's never a broad stroke that covers everything. There's
right,
gonna
of
be,
course.
Yeah.
And is this study that you mentioned earlier, is this out?
Oh yeah, it's an older study too. I don't remember the specifics in terms of the author, but I can get it to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, this just goes to show how we should not separate and siloed out metabolic diseases, mental health. Like, they most often than not are linked, and one causes the other, and it's a vicious cycle. And if you are going to treat metabolic disease or mental health, you almost need both. You almost need to combine the treatment that treats both.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's pivot a little bit back into the gut. I want to talk about leaky gut issues and microbiome. Now, is leaky gut also causing IBS and all these different diseases? Because we talked a couple of times on this show, and I come to understand, the lining of the gut and being affected negatively by certain foods, certain substances, and therefore the food particles, toxins, whatnot, get leaked into the bloodstream, and therefore triggering inflammation, triggering immune responses. What significance does that mean?
Yeah, so leaky gut is one of those things that conventional medicine refuted for a very long time. They said it's not real, it doesn't exist. And then somebody came out with a study that talked about intestinal permeability and gave the actual mechanism for what happens. And now it's accepted because we call it intestinal permeability, and that's like super sciencey. So now it is accepted in the medical literature that intestinal permeability does exist. Leaky gut probably still doesn't, but they're the same thing. It's just a different word. And what it means is exactly what you said, is that in the intestines you have an epithelial lining. It's 1 cell thick, it's very small, and that allows for the absorption of nutrients over the intestinal wall. And this epithelial lining should be really close together. The cells should be touching, just like a brick wall, the bricks behind us. And what happens is if there's inflammation present in the intestinal, in the lumen, then that inflammation can separate the cells of the epithelium, and they're not going to separate them like this, right? But you're going to have a separation there that is big enough that allows for food particles that are larger than your single amino acids or, your simple sugars or your broken down fatty acids. And so it's allowing those food particles to pass through that epithelium, and then on the other side, you have a whole host of immune cells that are there. And then your body says, whoa, foreign invader, sends the alarm, and then you have immunoglobulins, antibodies that are made against that food particle. And that shouldn't happen, because that food particle should have never been there. And so then what happens is then the next time, say it was broccoli, right? Healthy food broccoli, but it got over that epithelial lining, and now you have an immunoglobulin, an antibody to broccoli. So the next time that you eat broccoli, you may experience a wide variety of symptoms because your immune system is reacting to it because that epithelial lining is still leaky or permeable. And so people can experience, headaches, bloating, brain fog, fatigue. It's a wider range of symptoms that can result from intestinal permeability. It's also a delayed reaction. So in allergies, if you have a peanut allergy and you eat peanuts, it's within 15 minutes you're knowing that something bad is happening. But with food sensitivities, you have a delayed reaction, so it could be a day, it could be 12 hours, it could be 48 hours, and so it's really hard to identify where these are coming from. Food sensitivities, we want to get back to what is the actual issue here, though, and the issue is not the food. So one of my pet peeves in functional medicine is these doctors that are running all of these food sensitivity tests. It's like, that's not the culprit. That's the innocent bystander. Broccoli is not bad.
So if your body reacts negatively to a food, just avoid the food.
It's so silly, it's like I'm sure there's an analogy there, but it's you don't want to blame the person that's just standing there. Just because they were there at the scene of the crime doesn't mean they committed the crime. And so we want to see, what's the issue? The issue is that there's that intestinal permeability there. And why is that there? Inflammation of some sort. So the most common causes that I see in my practice are stress. So stress is huge. So when cortisol levels increase for a prolonged period of time, it suppresses or reduces secretory IgA. And that's an immunoglobulin in the gut that really acts as a buffer to that intestinal lining to protect it from invading pathogens and reduce inflammation and reduce the likelihood of intestinal permeability. So stress by far is the biggest culprit, but then you also have things like a standard American diet, a diet high in fat, high in sugar, high in calories that can cause systemic inflammation. You have things like alcohol, a direct irritant to the gastrointestinal tract. You have a whole host of things that could be at the root of it.
Right. I mean, stress is so hard to avoid. I mean, like nowadays we've got flash flood in San Francisco where I live, and we've got economy is not good, like everyone's stressed out. So
Yeah.
I think, people should pay more attention and more conscious to stress management for sure. So from your explanation, does that make sense that, that is basically the cause of why people develop intolerance to food or allergy to food later on in life, even though they weren't before?
Yeah. So allergies are a little bit different, but in terms of intolerances to foods, it's one of the main causes that you'll see is some sort of stress-induced or inflammation-induced issue in intestinal permeability that's going on. There's some other things too, but that's a big one.
So when you say intolerance, so the way I say it, if they eat a certain food and then say they have a rash, is that intolerance or is that allergy?
It depends. It could be either. So
Okay.
you can see it with either. An allergy we talk about is an IgE-mediated reaction from the immune system. So you have IgE and IgG. These are both immunoglobulins that are produced by our immune system. And so with an allergy, you have IgE that's being produced, and that initiates an immediate reaction because it's like a 4-alarm fire, right? It's like, oh shit, something bad is happening. And this is where you have anaphylaxis. So closing of the throat, trouble breathing can happen, swelling can happen. You're going to notice this in 15 minutes, and it's a medical emergency. So people will carry EpiPens with it. So that is different when we talk about an intolerance, and it's an IgG-mediated immune reaction, and it's delayed typically. So you won't see something in 15 minutes. It'll be much longer. It'll be much more vague usually, but you can get skin things that can happen.
And less dangerous, I assume.
Sorry, say it again?
Less dangerous, I assume.
Totally less dangerous, absolutely, yeah.
Great. This is like a immunology flashback where back in my masters, did not like immunology.
I was gonna say we're gonna have nightmares.
It was so complex. I remember clearly. I was like, I had to do immunology during my masters in biotechnology, and that was a task. So one thing that always happens on this show is that I have experts like yourself come on. We talk about the area of expertise. We talk about the disease progression. We talk about the development and the cause of the diseases, and it becomes so morbid. But then we forget, what are the things that we can do to actually prevent it? What are the things we can do to mitigate it? What are the things we can do to treat it? So let's, give our listeners some advice from all the wealth of knowledge and information that you have experienced, to tell us, like, okay, we have all these problems now. Food may be the problem, different substance, different pollutants, different stress levels, unhealthy living, like you said, standard American diet. Where do we begin if someone listens to this and say, my life might not be the healthiest, but I want to change? Where do we begin?
Yeah, I love that. And to tie it back into where we started with my personal story, I left that doctor's office hopeless. And that was really the feeling that was pervasive, was hopelessness. And I took an oath, just with myself, to say I don't want somebody to leave my office hopeless. And that's what we're talking about, is that there is hope. There's a lot of things that you can do if you have any of these issues going on. And a big one is just, the biggest ones are also the simplest ones, but they're usually not the easiest ones to do, right? And so with gut health, if we're really focusing on that, a lot comes down to diet. And so we want to optimize the gut microbiome in your favor. And from the science community, we actually don't know what that means yet, but we know a few of the players that definitely seem to help. And so when we're looking at the microbiome and optimizing it, we're looking at the diversity, which means if you're thinking of a jungle, the diversity of a jungle means there's a bunch of different species of plants, of trees, of animals, of flowers that are there. So it looks like it's not a monopoly, right? When you're looking at a city, it's a little bit more like gray, where it's, you got your buildings and you got your sidewalks. And so we want to make it that ecosystem that's really diverse. And in order to instill diversity in the microbiome, you need to instill diversity in your food choices. And so one easy thing you can do is go to the farmer's market or go to the grocery store every week and choose something new to eat. And new meaning not in a package ideally, but a vegetable that is different from the day before, high in fiber, different colors. So the different colors of vegetables are going to indicate the different polyphenols, antioxidants that are in your vegetable. And those are one of the food sources for the microbes in your gut. So your microbes eat polyphenols, they also eat fiber. And so you really want to have a diversity of different vegetables coming in, different foods, and switching those things. And so you could be the healthiest person in eating, broccoli and chicken and sweet potato, but if you eat that every single day, you're not optimizing for your microbiome. So you want to have a diverse array of things to choose from, just like our hunter-gatherer ancestors, where there wasn't enough of one thing to solely exist on it. They had to try different things and eat what was available.
And also quite seasonal as well, depending on what season there is and what crops that they have. We talked about this with Dr. Pompa actually on our show, and he talked about cycling different diets, even though, for example, some people may get a lot of benefits from ketogenic diet, some people might get from Atkins, and some people might benefit from carnivore, whatever. But over time, as your body loses its diversity in the microbiome, you may experience some form of abnormality, and it may manifest as symptoms or it may not, but it's advisable to cycle it around. Is that correct?
Yeah, ideally. Yeah, and we always meet the person with where they're at in terms of, somebody that's eating McDonald's every day, going to chicken, broccoli, and sweet potato every day, huge change that's going to benefit your health. So we just want to see where the person's at, and are we optimizing, or are we actually starting from the foundation?
Right. And obviously, now that I think about it, I'm like, we have to make a disclaimer. If you're eating chicken, broccoli, and you're really healthy, and then cycling doesn't mean that you go to eat like fast food and processed food.
Totally.
Still really avoid all the highly processed, hyper palatable food, all the refined sugar. That is the ground rule.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's like, I don't want people to listen to this and then they're like, do you know what Dr. Mary Pardee says?
Cycle in Burger King.
Yeah, cycle in Burger King. Tomorrow I'm going to cycle McDonald's.
Yeah.
And then the day after I'm going to cycle, Wendy's.
Totally.
So that's not the case.
Yeah.
So if our listeners would like to find out more about all of this information and learn more about Dr. Mary Pardee, where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks. So I post a lot of content on Instagram. My handle's at dr.marypardee, and then my business one is at modernmed, MODRNMED, and then website, have a lot of blog information there. I also have a gut health course on my website where I go through IBS, IBD, reflux. We talk about bloating there, constipation, diarrhea. I even talk about helminthic therapy, which is worm therapy for the gastrointestinal tract, which we didn't touch on. Some weird things too. And that's the website is www.modernmed.com, MODRNMED.com.
This has been a great session. I've learned so much. And I know that IBS affect more people than I knew. Because growing up in Malaysia, I don't remember having IBS as a common thing. I don't know whether it's because they haven't discovered it or just the lifestyle is different and the availability of these different foods that are causing IBS may not be available there. So that's an interesting point.
I got to dig in there.
Yeah.
I'll look into it.
So I didn't hear about IBS until I came to the US. So it has been a great informative session. I've learned so much. Thank you so much, Mary. And hope you guys enjoy it. And if you do like it, leave us a comment, ask any questions. I'm sure we'll get back to you. And until next time, thank you.
Thanks, Latt.